From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Free Expression with Gerry Baker.
Hello and welcome to Free Expression from the opinion page of the Wall Street Journal. I'm Gerry Baker, editor-at-large of the Journal. Thanks very much indeed for listening. If you're not already subscribing to Free Expression, then please do sign up at Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And if you're in the mood and you like it, please leave me a favorable review. Well, this week we are just a little over a week into the second Trump administration. And I think it's fair to say that Donald Trump has hit the ground running with a slew of executive orders, travel across the country already, and some interesting conversations in California, the scene of the wildfires. His nominations are speeding through the Senate for the most part. We may see some more this week. And of course, he has been issuing not just those executive orders, but all kinds of interesting policy statements to America and around the world, including upping the ante on his threat, shall we say, to take Greenland for the United States. So it's been an extraordinarily busy first week, and doubtless there is more to come. You could certainly not argue that Donald Trump and this new Republican administration is very serious about tackling the key issues of immigration, of the DEI. His assault on diversity, equity, inclusion has been a major feature of what he's been doing, and we can expect a lot more policies to come. But what about the politics of it all? Donald Trump was elected, as we all know, with a win in the popular vote and, of course, a comfortable win in the Electoral College. He has a small majority for the Republican Party in both houses of Congress. What does it all mean for the politics? Are politics being transformed by Donald Trump's second term? What are his chances of making this a real political success for the medium term? Well, I'm pleased to say this week I'm joined by an old friend of the podcast to talk about all this, Mark Penn. Mark is, of course, the CEO of Stagwell, a major media firm, but he's a long-standing veteran political consultant and pollster, having been a chief pollster for both of the Clintons, Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, and of course since then has been a regular commentator and analyst of polls and politics in general. I interviewed Mark Penn just a few days ago, and we talked about the politics of Trump's second term and what we can expect. We are a week into the new Trump administration, came in all guns blazing with that inaugural speech, then all of those executive orders. Clearly a man and administration in a hurry on all fronts, domestic and foreign. What's your early impression of Trump, given his victory, given the political circumstances which he finds himself in, and given what he's trying to do?
Well, I think he wants to be everything Biden wasn't. I think he wants to show that despite his age, he is 100% in charge of things. He is 100% accessible to the media. He's doing press conferences. He's doing late-night interviews. He's doing Oval Office press conferences. I mean, he is proving that he is accessible as a president. And I think he's getting his message out that he is going to be not just a reformer, but a disruptor. And that also, I think very clearly, this administration is hitting the ground running. He has his appointments. He has his executive orders. He is not going to be thrown off his course as he was last time. I mean, last time the resistance really got him, really stopped him dead in his tracks. They leaked every conversation. They undermined everything he did. They got investigations going against him. They had the public believing that he got elected because the Russians had supported him. This is a very different administration, a very different electoral result.
On some of those executive orders, a whole number of executive orders, many of which were very much in line with implementing what we expect on energy, on immigration, on the whole woke issues. There are some, obviously, that were controversial, and we can talk a little bit about that, and more broadly about sort of, if you like, the Trump approach here. Pardoning pretty well all of the January the 6th demonstrators, rioters, the people who've been convicted of crimes, was one surprising thing. Does that suggest, do you think, that some people wonder whether this is part of this larger, Trump will go himself do a sort of a lawfare kind of thing that happened to him under President Biden? Do you think this highly selective, politicized use of the law is now something we're just going to have to get used to?
Well, in this case, my problem with the whole January 6th prosecutions is we just don't do this in America. We generally respect political protest. And even when it's out of hand, I would have expected maybe 20 people at most might have been indicted who really were proven to have pre-planned an assault on the Capitol in some way, shape, or form. But to basically go after 1,000, 1,500 people who were really engaged in a protest about the outcome of the election. That's unprecedented. And to hunt them down with the FBI showing up at people's homes and taking some people with no criminal records into confinement.
But just to be clear, Mark, I mean, some of the people who've been released were, for example, I can cite some examples, been pardoned, I should say. Someone who used a brass knuckle to repeatedly beat a police officer, another one who used a hockey stick to repeatedly beat a police officer, another one who sprayed things in a police officer's face. I take your point about political protest, but even just a week before Trump took office, his Vice President J.D. Vance was saying, there will be pardons, but anybody who committed acts of violence won't get pardons. I mean, there's a difference, isn't there?
Well, I did expect that the pardons would be a little more circumscribed. But I think at the end of the day, what they said was, look, these people put no one in jail for burning down federal courthouses, disrupting cities, burning police cars. But yeah, they were going to indict every person who was in that. And I think that it was broader than I expected, broader than even, as you say, J.D. Vance expected. But I do think it was a protest that this Justice Department was wholly illegitimate from start to finish. And when a Justice Department is illegitimate, none of its convictions really count. So I expected it to be. Do I think that the public is going to be disturbed? I think this kind of passes over pretty quickly. I think people expected this. But I don't think that the reaction against Attorney General Merrick Garland is unjustified. He kicked off a Justice Department that would hunt down every person that just had a cell phone crossing into that, and initiated the investigations into Trump, seemingly after Joe Biden expressed his pique that he wasn't doing enough.
It's interesting you mentioned Merrick Garland. Of course, Joe Biden, on his literally last minutes in office, issued those pardons to his family, whole number of pardons to other people that had been issued earlier, including members of the January 6th committee in the House of Representatives. That still leaves, Merrick Garland included, quite a sort of rich range of targets for Trump if he does decide to pursue them. Do you expect him to?
Well, again, I don't see this in terms of Trump pursuing things. I see this as a bunch of people who had a corrupt enterprise that's been proven corrupt. It took over $20 million from interests adverse to Joe Biden, who lied about all of his contacts with his son's business when he was clearly fully involved in the business.
Most of those people have been immunized, in effect, by the preemptive pardon. I'm thinking more about political. Well, you mentioned Merrick Garland. I mean, do you think it would be legitimate to go after Merrick Garland?
I don't think you're going to see anything like that. I do think the question is whether or not the pay-for-play enterprise that Biden, his son, and brother had is going to face any accountability. I'd say probably it doesn't, if you ask me at the end of the day. But I think Joe Biden signed those pardons because he needed them.
Let's talk about the politics. How does Trump stand as he takes office? We know that Joe Biden left office with, I think, the lowest approval rating any president's had, maybe even including Jimmy Carter, and lower than Trump's was 4 years ago, which was obviously pretty low. Trump takes office, with still a rather divided country, but he's got probably a higher approval rating than I think he's had since, the early days of his previous presidency. What kind of mandate, what kind of political authority do you think Trump has right now?
Well, I think there's a very interesting difference between this election and the election in 2016. In 2016, Trump and Hillary Clinton both had approval ratings of about 35%. In this election, they both had Harris and Trump around 47. Trump's was a little bit higher. So the voters who voted for Trump this time liked Trump. Okay, and he went from 47, 48. He's now at about 53% approval rating. He's passed a majority of the country approving what he's doing. Joe Biden left office with a 39% approval rating. That gap is really why I never thought that Harris would win and that Trump would win, because fundamentally voters thought Biden did a bad job. Yeah. And you just don't, in politics, continue those people who you think are doing a bad job.
Do you think, again, on Trump's kind of political authority, I mean, obviously he's got a small majority in the House, small majority in the Senate. He can get, notwithstanding, it looks like all of his nominees have gone through, notwithstanding a small majority, he probably can get most of his legislation through. There will be, very, especially in the House, there may be some very knife-edge votes. But more broadly, in terms of the political authority and his mandate, you mentioned his relatively high approval rating given what he's had.
Not like when I worked with President Clinton. We were in the 70s. These are ways to go.
Right.
He is at least starting out for Trump at the highest place he has ever been.
Does that augur well? Because there's a view, which I've heard said sometimes and again, you've worked for presidents in these circumstances, but first of all, a president's authority starts leaching away through his second term, and by the time we get to the midterms, it's more or less gone and he's a lame duck. There is a view that, a president never has more authority or more power or more standing than on his first day of his second term, and then it starts going away there. How do you see that unfolding?
Well, again,
in the
my
next few
experience
months?
with the Clinton second term was we did an awful lot of stuff in that second term.
Yeah, remind us, what was that in early 97? What
We
was
balanced
that?
the budget.
Balanced the budget, of course, yeah.
You know, I think we helped the tech revolution kind of we had done welfare reform before. We did a number of things before the election, right? And until the Republicans did the impeachment things, which turned out to really backfire on the Republicans. But I would say that second term, in fact, I met with the president and the top staff with a strategic meeting every week. And I said, I assume these meetings are going to be over. No, they were never over. He was trying to get peace in the Mideast up until the last day of the administration. And I think you're seeing Trump here taking his unfinished first term and really kind of, I think, relishing every day that he is back in the Oval Office. You know, I used to say Democrats really liked the presidency and thought it was a good day if they did something in the presidency. Republicans thought it was a good day if they did nothing, right? Because they didn't want government to do stuff.
Yeah.
I think clearly this is an activist president in that sense. He is going to hit the ground running on all of these issues. He wants to keep his promises. Even though he is not going to have another election, I think public opinion matters to him.
Where do you think are the main risks, the main challenges to him? Either legislatively, we can talk a little bit about that given the slimness of the majority in the House, but more broadly politically, where are the risks? Again, you went through this with Clinton. Maybe you did foresaw the circumstances that led to Clinton's impeachment, which, of course, is a major kind of negative issue of his second term, although, as you pointed out, it didn't do Republicans any good in the midterms in 98. Where do you see the political risks for Trump in these coming first 6 months of this administration?
Look, the question always is in the first part of the administration, are you going to get your way and kind of get your administration going? First, you got to get your appointments out there. Second, you've got the executive orders out there. Third, you've got to resist court and other challenges to try to stop everything that you've got in progress. And then fourth, you've got to get the reconciliation bill right. Your big chance at getting your policies through where you don't need 60 votes in the Senate, and you can do it on a one-party basis, is going to be that reconciliation bill and what qualifies as a budget item versus substantive legislation. And then after that, if you get all those things done, then you need the economy to go right instead of wrong. You need the border to be shut down instead of open.
Do you think there's any risks on the border sort of taking a counter position that maybe these deportations, if he starts to do them, maybe the optics don't look so good, mothers being dragged out of their homes and is there a political risk? The American people are very kind-hearted and decent people. Might they start to just balk a little bit when they see maybe some of the kind of harsher human consequences of that?
Well, I think a lot of that's in the implementation, and it's very hard to tell between what Trump says he might do and what he actually does. And what he actually does is typically more reasonable than what he says he might do.
Right.
Now, if you ask me, the removal of people with criminal records, the concept of sanctuary cities giving sanctuary to criminals, there's zero support for that in this country. And I don't think you're going to see any hesitation. Now, going after people who've been born here or came in, I think that's another matter. And I think that's where there's some risk. There's always risk in each administration in probably the last 3 decades. If they go too far to the right or too far to the left. I don't think he's going too far to the left. So the question is, will he go too far to the right? But, there's another element here which was really unexpected, which is his reviving an alliance with the tech companies and getting foursquare behind American innovation. It really seems that Biden and the Democrats were using the tech companies just for their political aims, but didn't really care about them as innovators. And Trump is almost doing the opposite.
Yeah, how do you see that? You worked for a long time with Microsoft. You've had extensive experience there. And again, as you say, the tech company, I'm rather amused by the kind of hand sort of wringing that we're seeing from some people saying, oh my God, isn't it terrible? All these tech executives were at the inauguration and they're working hand in glove, and they seem instantly somehow to have forgotten that these tech companies working hand in glove with both the Obama and the Biden administrations, to the point not only of where so many Obama administration officials went to work for these companies, but as we famously remember, in the 2020 election, tech companies blocking news stories that were unhelpful to Biden. So I'm a little skeptical about this sudden alarm about tech companies having too much proximity to government. But how do you see, again, with your experience having worked in the tech companies, you describe this as a positive, that you think this administration is going to work? Is it going to essentially do the bidding of tech companies? Is it going to do what they want? Is it going to, a light regulatory touch? What's the relationship going to be?
I think you see Trump wants companies to invest in America. And where's that investment capital? really in America. It's sitting in the vaults of tech companies. There are hundreds of billions of dollars of cash that they have accumulated over the years. If he can get them to invest in America, that's going to really jumpstart his presidency because it jumpstarts the economy. Look, the big difference is, I think, and this isn't true of all administrations, but I think in the last administration, they didn't care about the economy. They cared about votes and messaging about the economy that would get them there. I think Trump cares about the economy itself. He doesn't want the tech companies to go gather him some votes or put out some message. He wants them to invest in the country. And that's why it's quite a good thing that they've coalesced around trying to get a favorable tech policy or industrial policy from the administration, because so goes tech these days, so goes the nation.
I'm going to take a short break there, but when we come back, I'll have more with Mark Penn, pollster, political commentator, political analyst, CEO of Stagwell. We're talking, of course, about the first few days of Donald Trump's administration and what the politics may hold for Donald Trump and the country over the coming few months. Stay with us.
You're listening to Free Expression with Gerry Baker. Don't forget, you can listen to the latest episode anytime on your smart speaker. Just say, play the Opinion Free Expression podcast. Now, back to Gerry Baker.
Welcome back. I'm with Mark Penn, pollster, political consultant. He's worked for Democratic presidents and presidential candidates in the past, but now very much an independent commentator. And we're talking about the first few days of Donald Trump's second administration and what we can expect in the next month or two. One of the issues that often dominates second terms, and by the way, I know we're in a slightly odd situation because it is his second term, but in areas of things like nominees, it's kind of a first term because normally when there's a second term, most of them just carry on from the first term. But it is a second term, and one of the things that does, especially as we get deeper into a second term, foreign policy often dominates second terms. You talked about Bill Clinton trying to get a Middle East agreement. Let's just talk about the politics of some of these things. Now, the Middle East, for example, again, he's pushing, we've got the ceasefire in place between Israel and Hamas. We've got this very kind of long, slow and uncertain lead time for the release of these hostages. Now, just a couple of weeks before he took office, Trump made that famous declaration that Hamas had better release all the hostages or all hell will break loose. Well, they've released a handful of hostages so far. There's still maybe close to 100 left. And as I say, a very, very long and uncertain timeline for getting them back. Is there a danger that that issue in particular could become a political problem for him, that he's been out there, issued his red line in the way that Obama famously did with Syria in 2015, and actually what's happening? Is he actually doing anything?
Well, look, I think underscoring what you're saying is that the biggest mistakes that the Biden administration made on foreign policy was to show weakness. On every issue and every conflict, they were seen as people who could be rolled back, whose red lines, weren't even red lines, they weren't even lines, right? And I think that Trump uses the threat of huge tariffs, the threat of all hell breaking loose, to get some progress. And I think most people think that the hostages that got removed, that deal would not have happened but through Biden alone, but it took the Trump envoy to at least get something moving here. Now, everybody knows that's not a solution to the problem, and everybody knows that Hamas can't be left to govern Gaza. But now there's a little breathing room to try to figure out if there is a solution to the mess, right? Could some of the other Arab countries come in? Remember, Trump is a disruptor, and he does come up with unconventional solutions to problems that are stuck. And I do think he had to create a little movement here. He had to show that he mattered in these negotiations. He obviously wasn't going to get 100 hostages walking out on that day, but he did get 3. He did get a ceasefire. He did get an agreement. No one thinks phase 2 is going in, but maybe that just buys the room to try to come up with a real solution here that would secure Israel and yet get the Gazans back in their homes.
Something else he promised to do in his first 24 hours was bring a settlement to the Russia-Ukraine war. I think we can all agree that was an ambitious and hyperbolic...
it's all a question of how many hours you think there are in a day. Like,
yeah, exactly.
By a day, a month.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. But seriously, it does look as though, and we just saw last week Trump coming out again, the outlines of what maybe it could be construed as an ultimatum to Vladimir Putin, sit down, get involved in talks, settle this thing, or we're going to ratchet up economic sanctions, make life tough. Again, you're right, he's a disruptor. He's also, of course, as everybody says 1,000 times, he's a deal maker. He's very transactional. Again, from a political point of view, well, let me put it this way. If there were some at least temporary resolution to this conflict while in the early stages of the Trump presidency, that would presumably be seen as a real diplomatic success for Trump.
Donald Trump with the Nobel Prize. How about
That's what
that
he wants.
one?
Yeah. I'm told that he's very
unexpected element. He's look, it's very interesting that he tried to label himself and did label himself as a peacemaker, right? And his intention there. But look, in the movie Patton, a scene that I always like where Patton goes out and he's absolutely crazy and tells his men, like, if you're not successful, don't bother to return alive. And his aide comes to him and very politely says, sometimes the men don't know when you're kidding or you're not serious. And Patton says, in response, it's not important for them to know. It's important for me to know, right? And I feel that Trump fits into that mode. What's most important from the position of Trump being president versus Biden is ultimately the foreign adversaries did not believe Biden would pull any triggers. And they believe that Trump will pull triggers. And that means that they're going to have to act differently. If you're sitting in Iran, you know that he's just maybe 24 hours away from giving Israel an okay to destroy all your nuclear facilities. And you know that Biden was never going to do that.
And one other issue that cuts across, obviously, foreign policy and economics is tariffs. And again, he's threatened to impose tariffs pretty well from next week on Canada and Mexico. In fact, he said he's not threatened. He said he's going to impose this 25% tariff immediately. Again, we know it's all about negotiating and transactions and all that kind of stuff. But a 25% tariff is serious business for American. We import a lot of stuff from both Canada and Mexico. We all understand the aim. The aim is to get more domestic production. The aim is to get more access for American companies to foreign markets. And again, we'll have to see how it's implemented. B, to what extent companies, exporters from abroad, absorb some of the cost increase itself. Is there a political risk there that people suddenly see everything's more expensive, whether it's, housing from lumber from Canada or whether it's some of the agricultural products we import from Mexico? Is there a political risk with this tariff strategy?
I mean, of course there is. I mean, there's the no pain, no gain kind of theory here, which is if he doesn't take the risk and if he doesn't, even though he wouldn't want to, have to sometimes pull the lever because otherwise he has no credibility, of course there's a risk that could backfire and there could be. But by and large, he's given people a real reason that he's doing it. It's interesting, the economics of tariffs, right? Democratic economists will say, oh, the consumer pays it all. Republican economists will say, oh, the country pays it all. The truth is it's some unknown mix that it is very hard to figure out in terms of who exactly is ultimately paying the cost of the tariffs. And it'll be interesting. Our thesis back in the day was actually on the politics of tariff and trade wars and protection. Will he kick off a trade war that he doesn't expect to, or will he successfully move people along and get things negotiated that without these threats were impossible? So far, he's got a pretty good track record on the second.
This is a very cynical question. We'll ask it anyway. In a sense, barring a serious recession or some major foreign policy disaster, do these things politically matter very much? The reason I ask that question is we've already seen since the election this kind of remarkable flip in how people view the economy, depending whether they're Republicans or Democrats. Nothing much has changed in the economy since November the 5th, but obviously the politics have changed. I'm sure you see this in your own polling, Mark. Are people now just seeing reality through entirely a kind of partisan political lens?
Some do, some don't. I still had most people saying things were negative, but I had about 20% of Democrats switch from positive to negative. About 20% of Republicans switch from negative to positive. But I do think, and I analyze it this way, you look at the voting pattern of the election. Those people under 30,000 voted for Harris. Those people 30 to 100,000 voted for Trump. Those people over 100,000 voted for her. And the way I analyze it is under 30,000, government support payments, absolutely critical to those people. They figured that they were going to be much better under a Democrat than a Republican or Trump. The 30 to 100,000, those people go to the grocery stores, they go to the gas stations, they get mortgages. They weren't voting on some tweet anywhere. They were voting on the reality that they were experiencing. And the over 100,000, they don't go to the grocery store. They're using Instacart. They are far removed from the everyday lives and being worried about the copay, from the thing. So I think that in many ways, his election was about this class difference between the working and the middle class versus the elites, and it was about the reality of their daily lives versus what people read in the papers.
Just briefly, before the end, about the Democrats, you advised Democrat presidents and Democratic presidential candidates in particular, successful ones and at least one unsuccessful one. And I don't want to get into here who's running in 2028, but what, from your experience and your polling perspective, just your general understanding and knowledge of politics at the moment, how do the Democrats, they do seem to be, arguably, given that the result, that the popular vote was 1.5 points for Trump and, the swing states all went for Trump, it wasn't a landslide, but they seem to be reacting as though it was a landslide. There seems to be, they've gone quiet. There's no real, so far, tremendously kind of outspoken opposition to Trump in the way that there was in 2016. What do they need to do to be competitive again?
Well, first, in the Harvard Caps Harris poll I just came out of the field with, Democrats severely tanked. They went down to a 41% rating. The truth is, I think there's more sunlight now on the policies, and Trump's approval rating may be 53%, but approval of most of his policies is like 60, 70, 75. He has much greater consensus on his main policy planks. Now, Democrats are in the wilderness. These numbers sustain that. It will be a long time before they come out of that wilderness. Whether they do successfully or not will depend upon how good or not the Trump administration is. Again, there's more objective reality that's not just communications. If 4 years from now, people think the Trump presidency was a good presidency, he's got his Nobel Prize, the economy did well, then Democratic politics will have to move to the center, right? The left will have been wrong. Those policies were rejected. The Republicans will have a real chance of continuation. If Trump is a failure, then the left is going to really assert itself in the Democratic Party, say, I told you so, and try to take the country back to the left. And we don't know the outcome of that until we get about 2 years into the Trump administration.
Which brings me neatly to my last question, which is, we don't know what's going to happen in the next 2 years. We don't know what Trump's going to be able to get through, get done. We don't know what events are going to intervene to change things. But it is already clear that Trump is an historic figure. Just in a very narrow sense, only second president in American history to be elected to non-consecutive terms. But obviously he's transformed the Republican Party. He's transformed our politics. Again, with the big caveat that we're at the start of a term where things can go in all kinds of directions. But as it stands, how do you see already Trump's place in the political history of the last 50 or 60 years or so?
It is soaring from where it was. Had he not done this comeback, he would have been like an exception at one time. Somehow Hillary was disliked, and I think now he realigned the political parties. He realigned the voting constituencies of America, which is the working middle class and working class voters who were traditional Democratic voters are now Republican voters. The traditional educated elites who were Republican voters are now Democratic voters, right? So he realigned the entire political structure of the country, flip-flopped on the issues, reasserted kind of a completely different agenda from where Democrats are going, and he's going to have a chance to maybe have 4 and be followed by someone else who'll come along with another 8 years. And I think, from the historical figures, we know that Reagan and Clinton were the two-term presidents to really leave office, successfully. The rest really didn't, okay? And Trump now has an opportunity to come out, I think, in a class of presidency along with those.
Mark Penn, thank you very much indeed for joining Free Expression.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for this week's episode. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. I'll be back again next week with another conversation. In the meantime, have a great week.